Hello, Zora. Today, I'm in my professor outfit because, I don't get to see my students again at the end of the year like I usually do, and some of them are going to be graduating and moving on. So I thought that I would dress up one time, for my lectures for them. And while I was at it, I thought I'd go ahead and say hi to you too. So these are my colors. University of Illinois. That's where I got my That's where I got my PhD, my doctorate. So no matter where I work, no matter what university I'm in, anywhere in the country, I wear the colors of the U of I. All right. Well, let's get started. Before we talk any more about history, we're going to have a lesson in geography. Now, history and geography are both part of social studies, and I know that you have social studies in the first grade. Social studies, of course, is the study of things having to do with people. Now, history is the study of what happened to people. I guess you could say geography, which is a study of really where places are. I guess you could say it's also a study of where things happen to people. And geography uses a lot of maps. I love maps. Maps are very helpful for figuring out where you are, figuring out where you're going, and they're also fun. I like to make up my own maps of imaginary places and imaginary worlds and tell stories about them. But maps are also very important for the real world and for studying history. We've already looked at several maps in these videos. Here's one of the maps we've already looked at, a map of the whole world kind of spread out flat like it had been peeled off of the globe and spread on a table. And you see, as we talked about before, the New World and the Old World. That doesn't mean that parts of the world are older than other parts. We've talked about this before. It's the fact that the people who lived in the gray area called the Old World, they thought that those gray parts were the whole world. They didn't know there was anything else out there until they made boats that were good enough that they could sail across the ocean. And then, lo and behold, look, there's other places they didn't know about. So they called those other places that are in green here the New World. But there were already people living there, and it wasn't new to them. To the people already living there, of course, it was the Old World. Now, by the way, this video is going to have a lot of information and maybe a little bit hard to keep straight. You may have to watch it like a gazillion times, but I know you're pretty smart, so you can probably get it down in like half a gazillion times or less. Anyway, there's this one little green area over by itself. That's called Australia. There were also people already living there. It took the Old World people longer to find that than it did for them to find the much bigger area there, which, by the way, that bigger area is called the Americas. In fact, if you look at this red line, everything above that red line is called North America, and everything below the red line is called South America. Now, today, North America and South America, they each have several countries in them, which is usually how it works. Just like, for example, over in Africa, which is a really big place, it's not a country, it's got a bunch of countries inside it. North America and South America and Africa, those are called continents. And a continent is a really, really big land mass. There are 7 of them altogether in the world. There's North America and South America. There's Africa. And there's also Asia, that's pretty big. And there's Europe. And there's Australia. down there. Now, Australia is the smallest continent, and it doesn't have a bunch of little countries on it. It only has one country on it, and that country is called Australia. But wait, you might be saying, because I know you can count really well, you may have noticed there's only 6 continents there, and I said there are 7. What's up with that? Well, the 7th one is way down here on the bottom, so they didn't even put it on that map. It's called Antarctica, and it doesn't have any countries on it because there aren't any people who live there except for scientists who study it, because Antarctica is really, really cold and it's covered in ice. I said there's no people that live there. Penguins live there and other animals that thrive in that environment. Now, if we zoom in on North America, if we make it real big so that we can see what's inside it, you can see some of the countries that are in North America. You can see there's Canada, Greenland way up there at the top, which is like a giant island. Mexico is down near the bottom, and Ecuador and El Salvador, a bunch of smaller countries down below that. And then right smack in the middle, you've got the United States of America. Right there smack in the middle, as well as way up there in Alaska. That's part of the United States also. So that's where we are on the world map. Well, now let's go back and take a closer look at the old world. In particular, let's take a closer look at Europe. Europe is where most of our family originally came from. That is our great grandparents, right? Most of them came from Europe. I talked about that a little bit in one of the earlier videos about how most of the people, if you trace it back on your mother's side, especially on my side, came over as indentured servants, remember, from England. Well, let's take a closer look at Europe and see some of the many countries that are there, and some of them I bet you've heard of. Maybe some of them you haven't, but I bet several of them you have. And in fact, I found some pictures just for some of these countries, just to take a look at some of the kids from those countries to see what they look like. Now, nowadays, in Europe, there's all kinds of different people who live there, just like in the United States. Just like when you go to school, there's all kinds of different kids. But the people that originally came from Europe, they all kind of looked like this, like these kids, like we look. There's Spain and France and Germany and England. England is not on that map right there. We're looking at the map of Europe because England is one part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. So we're going to zoom in on what's called the British Isles, their islands there, and take a close-up look at them, and then you can see where England is. That's the big red spot. It's not red in real life. That's just, for the map. The big red spot, that's where most of our ancestors came from. Many of our ancestors also came from Scotland, which is to the north of England, and many of them came from Ireland, which is one big island that used to be one country, but now it's divided into 2 different countries, 2 different kinds of Ireland, if you will. All right, well, that's that side of the family. However, your dad, many of his ancestors, that's the people that came before you in your family, many of his ancestors came from Germany. And here we can take a look at Germany there. And you'll notice that there's a town in Germany. Do you see what it's called in the little writing there? It's the little town of Kronenberg. And that's where the first Cronenbergs came from that town. The first Cronenbergs to go across the ocean and come to the United States. Speaking of traveling across the ocean from the old world to the new world, we need to talk about this guy briefly, Christopher Columbus. He was a sea captain and navigator who actually worked for the King and Queen of Spain, which is right there. But he himself was actually from Italy. In fact, Christopher Columbus wasn't really his name. That's how we say his name in English. His name was actually Cristoforo Colombo, which is how you say it in Italian. By the way, I really love Italian food. Don't you? I mean, look at that. Does that not look delicious? Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah. So anyway, Italy. That's the part of Europe that looks like a boot. Anyway, in 1492, lots of people in Europe wanted to be able to get to India, where they have lots of nice stuff. At that time, they had lots of nice stuff you couldn't get anywhere else. Lots of spices that the Europeans really liked. However, it was a dangerous trip to make over land. Now, at that time, some people thought the world was flat, but a lot of people knew that actually it was round. And so Columbus decided that it might be worth a try to, in order to get to India, go the opposite direction. Because if the world is round like a ball, if you go this way, you'll go all the way around and come back here. So the King and Queen of Spain gave him 3 ships to try this with, and they set off across the ocean. Now the problem is, a lot of people knew the world was round, but nobody knew how big it was. And nobody in the old world, in Europe, nobody knew that there was this huge 2 continents in between them and Asia. So after Columbus set off, he ran smack into this new world, which he was a little confused. He didn't know it was a new world. He thought he was in India. And so he called the people that he met there Indians. And by the way, he was not very nice to them, but that's a different story that we may talk about later. So anyway, see how important it is to have a good map. It wasn't long before other people from Europe figured out that Columbus had not actually been to India at all, that something else had happened. Well, since he clearly had not been to India, the Europeans were like, yeah, what are we going to call it then? And they decided to call it America, after another Italian navigator named Amerigo Vespucci, who was the first person to make a map of the New World. See, I told you maps were important. Well, since people from India are called Indians, and yet Columbus had started calling these other people Indians, that could be confusing. Didn't bother to ask them what they call themselves. Anyway, Europeans were like, well, what are we going to call them? So they started calling them American Indians, so that they could tell the difference between them and people from India. Later on, when I was about your age, people started using the term Native Americans. Native means from a place originally. Well, American Indian isn't really accurate because they're not from India, but a lot of those folks prefer to be called American Indians rather than Native Americans and some of the other ways. So nowadays we say both. Actually, those native people would prefer usually to be called by the name of their people, and there's a lot of different kinds. In fact, in the United States today, there are 568 different groups or tribes, sometimes they're called nations, of Native American Indians. And some of them are similar to one another. Some of them are very different and unique, which means one of a kind. And these are just the names of some of them and where they are from in the United States. The Cherokees you are familiar with because of that book about the Trail of Tears, and you can see where they live. That's right where Tennessee is. Well, next time I will talk a little bit about how those different tribes lived and still live in some cases, and where they're from, and some things about them. And yes, there will be maps.